Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today. I want to be a part of it. New York, New York, these vagabond shoes.
Tony, who's a journalist, is going to be giving us a presentation called In the Footsteps of the Beats, the Poetry Project at 50. So please help me introduce Tony Hoffman.
Bonjour. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for coming out this morning. Yeah, I have been a regular attendee of the Poetry Project since around 1998, and have attended workshops in all that time with a wide range of poets. My first workshop was actually somebody who some of you here should know, as he's an expatriate American who was living in France until he died, Steve Rotifer, and then many other poets over the years. I attended a one-night workshop with Ed Sanders on his investigative poetry, and they also have a New Year's Eve marathon in which up to 150, not just poets, but writers, fiction writers, essay writers, dance performers, musicians, and I'm sure there are some other creative arts that are that I've forgotten about. They have a 3 weekly reading series going on. This is for the winter months. They're just coming back for the fall. There's going to be a large kickoff event that hasn't been announced yet, but it's always something very apropos, very often related to either some poet who died or current events in the world. But let me get on with telling you a bit about the Poetry Project. This building has been central to the Poetry Project, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, and with events running into this year, it's really hard to pinpoint a date, as we'll find out shortly. It's in what they call the East Village now, which before that was the Lower East Side, and before that, well, we'll find out also in a minute. This particular church has a long history of supporting the arts. Among the people who have given presentations, talks, there are Isadora Duncan, Harry Houdini, Frank Lloyd Wright, William Carlos Williams, Carl Sandburg, Khalil Gibran. W.H. Auden was a parishioner there. I'm not certain that he performed there, but I can't imagine that he didn't. But this church was built in 1799, but its history goes back long before that. When I come to a city like Paris, I'm just overawed by the depth and richness of the history of a place like this, and particularly the different places. On any street you can find something from the Beat Hotel to things far more ancient, and the history of the Poetry Project and its church are among the deepest in New York City. It's been called the second oldest building in New York. It all depends on how you measure it, because before the church that we briefly saw before, there was this man, Petrus Stuyvesant, who was the 7th and final Director General of the New Amsterdam colony in the New World. And in 1666, he bought land for, no, 1660, he bought land for a farm or Bowery, and on it he had built a Dutch Reformed chapel. And 4 years later, the British sailed in with 4 ships and about 500 soldiers, basically requested that they turn over the colony, and Stuyvesant acceded, and it became shortly after that New York, although he was allowed to live out the rest of his days on his Bowery. And he died in 1672 and was buried beneath the wall of the current, what's now the wall of the current church. Now, if you go into the rectory late at night, it's rumored that you can hear, at a certain place, you can hear his ghost. I personally haven't, but I know of people who claim to have, so take that as you will. This is looking from the second floor down the old church bell, and this this gravestone here is from for Daniel K. Tompkins, who was the governor of New York and the vice president of the United States, and his largest claim to fame is probably banning slavery from New York State. So this whole grounds has a very rich history, and I had the pleasure to meet a caretaker at St. Mark's when I recently went down to take some photographs. By the way, all the photographs in this are my own, and this fellow was able to relay to me a lot of the history, and it is really a remarkable place. And if you do go to New York, even if you don't have a chance to catch a reading, I suggest that you pay it a visit. It's very accessible by mass transit. Non-traditional poets in search of a venue. What happened was that in the late 50s, early 60s, several coffee shops sprang up in which, let's say, non-traditional poets, whether they be Black Mountain or Beat or from various New York School and other backgrounds, they basically were finding a foothold in various clubs, and they didn't always receive that great a welcome. There was resistance sometimes from the authorities, from the communities, and in some cases the owners of the venues. But just a few predecessors. You'll notice a couple of them have Parisian names. And the first night that I was here, we had dinner at Le Deux Mago, which, but in this case, the coffee shop they made was Le Deux Migo. So instead of referring to the 2 Chinese gentlemen here, it was the 2 cigarette butts. Allen Ginsberg theorized that, actually he did some tracing of the history of some of these clubs, and he thinks that the McDougal Street bar, which held readings in the late 50s, was a direct predecessor, and that they were also inspired by the San Francisco and Berkeley Renaissance, and even before that, the Paris existentialists. And he traces their inspiration back to the ancient Forum in Rome. Now, particularly the final 2 here, Le Deux Migo and the Café Le Metro, they had quite a roster of a lot of the poets who were forging new ground in that era. And among them were Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Diane de Prima, Diane Wachowski, Ted Berrigan, John Ashbery, Leroy Jones, William F. Burroughs, William S. Burroughs read there, as did Ferlinghetti, and Bob Dylan also performed there. So this place had a very, some of these places, a very rich poetic history. And the trouble is that the venues wouldn't last for one reason or another. In the case of Cafe Le Metro, a couple things happened. They actually received resistance from the city, which became rather diligent in trying to crack down on places that didn't follow the so-called cabaret laws, which were basically, if you provide entertainment in a coffee shop or bar, you have to have a special license and pay more money. And a lot of the New York Police Department at some point made a concerted effort to enforce this. Part of it seemed to be a thing of the idea that these poets were subversive and we better clamp down on them. And Cafe Le Metro was closed because of this for a while, and they fought the cabaret law, and with the help of the American Civil Liberties Union, they won. Apparently, one of the owners was a Reagan Republican and may not have been thrilled with the content of much of the poetry that was going on there, but for whatever reason it closed by 1966. And although there were still some venues that did avant-garde and non-traditional poetry, they felt a squeeze, and they were looking for venues. And this fellow, Paul Blackburn, who is probably the most instrumental person in forming the poetry project and was heavily involved in the two reading series with the cafes, and Diane Wachowski and let's see, Jerome Rothenberg and several other poets who were regulars at these groups formed a committee to work with St. Mark's Church to develop a reading series. And the reverend at St. Mark's Church was a man named Michael, I just blacked out on his, Michael Allen. And he was an activist, and he was very interested in getting the arts, supporting the arts in his community. And he was receptive. The trouble that they had, which a lot of churches and other small institutions have, is how do you pay for it? And the Poetry Project received a large grant with the help of the New School for Social Research, entitled Creative Arts for Alienated Youth. And it was set up as a program to combat juvenile delinquency. A lot of the wayward youth who got involved with it were already active poets. And it's unclear how helpful the staff was in aiming for the goals that are described at the bottom of this page, in deflecting the trouble-free, while a lot of the staff as well were very involved in activism, which I don't know. The problem, of course, was that now they're accepting a lot of money from the government. This is the late 60s. a lot of people are skeptical of the government, if not downright hostile. And this came out in a lot of the communications that the Poetry Project produced, although the government seemed to have looked the other way. But there was a lot of tension. There was also a film project that Alan had, that was part of the grant that ended up failing, and a lot of some people blamed Alan and the government money for its failure. It wasn't clear to me in researching it exactly how he would have been at fault in that, but there is a price tag. And for a couple of years, the Poetry Project relied on grants, but after that, they became self-funding. Anne Waldman, could you turn out the light for a minute? Because this really doesn't do her justice. I'm not sure. Hopefully, yes. Well, she was okay. The picture itself is not rendered very well, so don't worry about that. She was the assistant director from the beginning. The reverend who was in charge of appointing the Poetry Project staff, for some reason, overlooked Blackburn in selecting a director, and Joel Oppenheimer served as the first Poetry Project director for a couple of years, but he was not really that interested in administration. So Anne Waldman took over and was for the first from 1968 to 78 served as director, and she's still a guiding light involved in the Friends Committee, the Poetry Project. And in the early years, they have a publication that lasted until not too long ago called The World, and it was the part of the grant was that they needed to publish stuff, so they bought a Gestetner mimeograph machine, probably not dissimilar to the one that our friend Jim Pennington demonstrated for us last year in Manchester. And they published The World, so to speak, and also allowed numerous other poets to publish their own little magazines and chapbooks and the like. And the World, though, the editor of The World, the direction of it was less inclusive. I mean, when the Poetry Project began, it was all these people, the Beats, the Black Mountain Poets, the New York School, and publication was less. Over time, it was less of the people who were involved in those other reading series were being published, and more of the New York School type poets were. And I think a lot of it was that the appeal just to young people, particularly living in New York where that is relevant. I was thinking about it today. I don't hear new poets anymore being called New York School or second or third generation New York School, although some of them still carry on in that tradition. But at any rate, Anne Waldman was a strong advocate, as she still is. Let's see. Okay. Allen Ginsberg. He was a great friend to the Poetry Project for many years. And although he didn't have I don't believe he ever had an active official role. He gave numerous readings. He was published numerous times in the newsletter, and was really a strong friend up until shortly before he died. Patti Smith and Lenny Kaye. When I first came to the Poetry Project and started attending their New Year's Eve marathons, I was a little bit in awe and surprised at the quality of some of the musical performers they got, in particular, in terms of their prominence. Patti Smith and Jim Carroll and Richard Hell and Lee Ronaldo and others, and actually not just rock and rollers and punks, but other people like either experimental, like Philip Glass, who comes plays the piano each year, and Steve Earle, who mostly, I assume, for his political stands. At any rate, Patti Smith gave her first poetry reading at the project on February 10th, 1971, which is just a couple of years into its history. And during the reading, she brought Lenny Kaye up, and they played as well as read. So let me see. Jim Carroll. I have a spoken word recording of him talking about coming to the Poetry Project as a lost youth and just helping out in small ways, and then eventually getting more involved in both in poetry and music. And if any of you were at Daniel Kane's talk 2 years ago in Brussels about poetry and music in New York City, he talked a lot about this, how many of the people who made a presence in the New York punk and new wave scene originally came as writers, and many of them still either write or have gone back to writing. Patti Smith, of course, has written several books since there's a great intergenerational presence in the poetry project. I mean, I talk about there being different schools. Anselm Berrigan is one of Ted Berrigan's sons. I've been in workshops that both Anselm and Eddie Berrigan have taught. Ted Berrigan, actually, he stylized himself as a late beat, although he was also strongly a New York school poet. But what was it? I'm sorry. Anselm also served as the creative director for the Poetry Project for many years, and while he was doing that, he compiled just columns from the Poetry Project newsletter over the years that he had liked, and he had put them on his desk, and he's finally brought them to fruition as a collection. What is Poetry? Just Kidding, I Know You Know. Interviews from the Poetry Project newsletter, 1983 to 2009. And there's a lot of wonderful material in here, from Allen Ginsberg and Ed Sanders to numerous poets from various current traditions. And this past year, a tree was planted in honor of the Poetry Project's 50th anniversary, and it's one of a number of trees that have now been published in not published, but planted in honor of poets from Allen Ginsberg, Frank O'Hara, Ted Berrigan, Paul Blackburn, Michael Skolnick, and W.H. Auden. Here's a quote from Etel Adnan about the Poetry Project. And I mean, being in the middle of it, sometimes it's hard to realize just what you have. It's like sometimes I think, well, it's sort of like a mini Naropa, but it's not accredited, and it's really designed to serve the local community. But it does have a farther reach than I would always recognize. So it's quite a remarkable institution. It's at 50, and it came into the world in an age of great turmoil in the late 60s, and now it has to exist in another area of a different kind of turmoil. But the importance and value of words and how they're used is something that we can't afford to forget. And I have great hope that it will be just as important and vital to the community and hopefully to the world at large over the next 50 years. Thank you.
Autumn in New York, why does it seem so inviting?